Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of On Orbit's Future Space Economy webcast. This one's titled Keeping Space Clean and Safe for Everyone, the Global Sustainability Mission, produced in partnership with our sponsors Kepler Communications, Sidus Space, and Spider Oak. My name is Jeffrey Hill, Executive Chair of the Satellite Show. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this very, very important discussion. We're also joined today by Via Satellite's Senior Managing Editor, Rachel Jewett, who will be taking over moderating duties for this discussion. I've been hit hard by the cold and flu season this year. I want to spare you all for my constant coughing and sneezing. But Rachel knows this topic very well. You're in very good hands. I will jump back in at the end to wrap things up. But for now, I'll turn things over to Rachel. Rachel, thank you so much for stepping in today, and enjoy this discussion.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jeff. So once again, I'm Rachel Jewett, Senior Managing Editor of Via Satellite, and I'm leading today's discussion, Keeping Space Clean and Safe for Everyone, the Global Sustainability Mission. We have three awesome speakers on our panel today, and in just a minute, we'll get into our discussion. For those in the audience, we want to invite you to participate by asking questions throughout the hour. You can submit them through the Q&A panel, which is on the right side of the webinar interface. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, weaving them in throughout the discussion. And I will ask those questions for you, and your identity will be anonymous. So please don't wait until the end to submit your questions. All right, so I'm happy to introduce our speakers before we get into the discussion. I'm here with Patricia Cooper, President and Founder of Constellation Advisory, LLC. Prior to establishing Constellation Advisory Space Consultancy, Patricia led government affairs for the Starlink satellite broadband constellation, SpaceX, where she secured FCC authorization for a record 12,000 satellites. She has also served as Intelsat's Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy, led the Satellite Industry Association as President, and worked at the FCC's International Bureau. She is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Space, the Hague Institute of Justice's Off-World Council, and the Advisory Committee for the International Astronomical Union's Center for the Protection of Dark and Quiet Skies. So Patricia, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us about your work with Constellation Advisory and what brings you to the discussion of space sustainability?
Well, thanks, Rachel. It's great to be with you all. And this is, a hot topic and a topic that has a lot of different facets. So I'm glad to be here with Kristen and with Audrey to talk about these issues. So when I left SpaceX, I found that a lot of companies were trying to figure out how to navigate space policy, space regulation, and just how to present the many kinds of projects effectively to government. I think there's still a little bit of a gap between understanding the purpose of projects and how to fit modern forward-looking satellite projects in a construct that doesn't always reflect today's modern space environment. So that's what I've been trying to do. I'm really excited to see what's happening in space, the enthusiasm, the investment, the innovation, and trying to bring that together with permissions and a good conversation with government leaders is a good inspiration for me. And then, of course, the topic of astronomy is one that fits into that category. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. We also have Audrey Schaffer. Audrey is Vice President of Strategy and Policy at Slingshot Aerospace, a company that is aiming to accelerate space sustainability to create a safer, more connected world. Audrey was most recently the Director for Space Policy at the National Security Council. As the lead for national security space policy matters within the Executive Office of the President and lead for space policy on the National Security Council staff, she advised the President, Vice President, and National Security Advisor of the United States on military intelligence, civil and commercial space policies and strategies. While at the White House, Audrey established the U.S. policy to refrain from conducting destructive and direct ascent anti-satellite missile, ASAT, what a mouthful, ASAT missile testing, developed a new space security policy approved by President Biden, and wrote the U.S. Space Priorities Framework, defining the Biden-Harris administration's vision for space activities. That I have covered a lot of those developments here at Via Satellite, so that's awesome you were behind those. Can you tell us about what Slingshot Aerospace does and what drew you to the company, Audrey?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I should really shorten my bio because every time everyone reads all that, it's kind of a humbling experience all over again. But thanks very much for having me. I'm really excited to join Kristen and Patricia. So Slingshot Aerospace is, as you said, a space domain awareness company. We are monitoring activities in space. We are collecting those activities into our platform, and we are building a common operating picture for all space operators of everything happening in the space environment. And if you have this common operating picture of all satellites operating in space, debris, historical information, present information, and using artificial intelligence and machine learning to project future activity in space, then you can really use that for a whole number of applications, ranging from spaceflight safety, constellation management, space traffic coordination, to education, training, and exercising for space security and space operations for the military and defense sector. So we're trying to help improve all satellite operators' ability to understand the environment in which they're living.
Very cool. Your CEO, Melanie Strickland, was the Via Satellite Executive of the Year for 2023. Actually, 2022. She won this past year. And I had a really interesting conversation with her for that. All right, I will introduce our last panelist. Kristin Shahady is the Business Development Manager at Astroscale U.S., where she is the Principal Capture Lead for government efforts. Before joining Astroscale, Kristen spent 6 years as a systems engineer at Ball Aerospace, where she worked on data processing software for the weather system follow-on microwave satellites. Prior to that, she was a systems engineer on stereoscopic imaging software at Lockheed Martin Missile and Fire Control, led the Space Generation Fusion Forum as manager, and was educator at the Kennedy Space Center. So thank you, Kristen, for joining the panel. Can you tell us how you joined Astroscale and give us an update on what the company is doing to keep space clean?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be here with these fellow panelists that are passionate about space sustainability, as Astroscale is, which was originally founded on the principle of space sustainability for future generations to use space. So Astroscale drew me in by this vision, and currently Astroscale is a mission provider. We work on technology that can provide different types of sustainable missions, whether it is life extension, whether it is transportation of different objects in orbit. These are all critical technologies to be providing to the space industry in order to make sure that we can still use space, as we are more dependent on it than ever before at the current day.
Yeah. So to kick off our discussion, Kristen, I'll stay with you. I want to get a sense of what crowded means in space. There's, a lot of people say space is crowded, space is getting more crowded. So what does that actually mean? And how are the ways that we describe that?
It's a great question, because we all know that space is massive, right? And one object, multiple objects in orbit, it's hard to get your head around what a crowded sensation would be. And the way that I interpret that is we are doing more exciting, innovative ways of using space. So this requires more communication. It requires more coordination amongst other users and other space operators. So with all of that new sensation and these objects moving very quickly, there's more objects in low Earth orbit than ever before. And so it creates the sensation that low Earth orbit is crowded because we have many more activities we have to do in space.
Audrey, so I know that Slingshot Aerospace owns Data, which collects a ton of data on the space environment. So how many active and inactive satellites are orbiting Earth right now? And how many of those are in low Earth orbit, or LEO?
Yeah, so Slingshot's Sarah Data Service, which is this incredible database of basically everything launched into space since the beginning of the space age, has over 12,000 objects having been launched into orbit around Earth over that entire period. And of those, a little more than 12,000 objects, about 3/4 of those are active satellites and 1/4 of them are inactive, which is interesting because, what that basically means is in the last, 5 years or so, more objects were launched into space than the entire cumulative history of the space age up until that point. Now, to your question about where those objects are, about a little over 90% of them, of the active objects, are in low Earth orbit. Now, one more statistic I want to offer to sort of provide some context here. 8 of all the objects in space, not just those in low Earth orbit, about 80% of the active objects are commercial objects today. Now, here's one more. 80% of the inactive objects are government, which is really fascinating that those numbers are about the same, because what it shows you is that we've entirely flipped. It's that as we flipped into this sort of exponential growth in the number of commercial satellites, the government has sort of not kept pace at all, and that's okay, because the history has been this government-dominated domain, and now we are sort of in this new era of commercial dominance.
If I could add too, I think the other flip has been we've figured out over decades of trial and error what applications thrive when delivered from space. And more specifically, we've seen a real sea change, maybe not sea change, but a change in what applications suit low Earth orbit. If you recall, the first rounds of low Earth orbit were primarily sort of cell phone enhancements, and I think they've done, had a real effect on our world, but the cell phone industry itself had more of an impact. And then we tried a little bit of, satellite entertainment, and that certainly had an effect on the world, but we're seeing massive impact from Earth observation data, the effect the information that can provide for climate change and analytics, for agriculture, for fishing is extraordinary. And I think we're just at the very beginning of it. That's a driver for satellites in low Earth orbit. The same is true for constellations that are providing broadband. If anything, the pandemic underscored that connectivity, even in remote and rural parts of the world, is essential and best delivered, or arguably well delivered, from low Earth orbit. So that's, I think, what we sometimes forget is to mention what's propelling these proposals for tens or even hundreds of thousands of satellites. It's applications that people want that are going to change in some cases people's lives and the world. And so there's a real purpose for that growth, and that flip that both Kristen and Audrey mentioned.
Yeah. So one of the the worst case scenario that gets brought up is the Kessler syndrome, where debris turns into a cascading debris scenario in low Earth orbit that would make the orbit unusable. Has anyone done the math on how many satellites it would take to reach a Kessler syndrome? Patricia, I'll go to you with that one.
That's a little bit of a misdirection, in the sense that the Kessler syndrome is an effect. It happens after a collision. So, and that's like saying, when would there be a pileup on a highway, and how many cars? And that's not really the right question, because there's so many other elements that go into the drivers of the collision. So I actually don't think that's something that we can kind of calculate, how many satellites, what's the carrying capacity of space, because it is so dynamic in terms of the functionality, in terms of the precision, the maneuverability, the tracking, the removal of objects that might be hazards. So I personally don't believe that that's a path to go down, but I think the fear of a Kessler syndrome, which is the outcome of it, is a worthy thing to be driving us towards technologies like Astroscales, towards insights like Slingshot can provide, and arguably also expectations that we place on space actors to avoid being that slow car in the lane they shouldn't be in that causes the pilot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On that similar line of thought, Kristen, how does the formation of new satellite systems impact the level of risk they create in space? So, obviously we've seen a ton of growth in the last few years, and there's expected to just be even more satellites launched in the coming years. So how does that affect the risk?
I think what's important with this question is, how do you define risk? Because there's different types of risk for different types of missions, right? And most importantly, I think we're avoiding collisions, right? And so that's critical to certain business cases when it comes to constellation providers, right? And so that's a new risk that has to be addressed in order to operate well in business. However, I think that due to the new circular economy that's building in space and this new infrastructure that multiple companies are trying to promote and provide data for, I think that there's a new way to mitigate risk that may have even been newly introduced and within itself mitigated by learning how to reuse some of these objects when they are no longer of need for different providers. There's also ways that we can look at repairing or recycling different objects. And that way we can reduce risk of, say, orbital collisions, which is ultimately the goal to make space more sustainable. So, in conclusion of that thought, the biggest idea for mitigating risk is also making sure that we have technology growth that can also mitigate risk in new and innovative ways.
Audrey and Patricia, do either of you want to weigh in on if there's increased risk or how we manage risk for the number of new systems that are going up?
I mean, I think one of the things that's become really evident in the last couple of years is the need for coordination among spacecraft owner-operators. This notion of space traffic coordination, wherein everyone has a certain level of information about activities that are happening, sort of in their orbits, or potential conjunctions that may involve their space object, and that they have not only the information, but actually the means to communicate with the other operators that could be affected by a given situation, so that owner-operators can coordinate potential responses, so that you don't, for example, have two operators maneuvering to, instead of solve a potential conjunction, actually make it worse. And so it is like these sort of data sharing mechanisms and these communication protocols. Those are the two issues that I think have really emerged recently, where there's a recognition kind of at a global level, I would say, that, we sort of understand what needs to be done, but we don't quite have the processes and the mechanisms to implement them yet.
So yeah, and I would just add, there's a pretty well established process for coordinating across satellite systems on the radio frequency side. These companies talk to each other all the time if they're operating in the same frequencies. Satellites usually have multiple operators in the same bands, and they need to make sure that they can coexist without harming each other's services. And so we don't have that for physical collision avoidance, for physical coordination and interference avoidance. And I think that's something that is emerging. You've seen the event of some of the larger constellations working with NASA. I think SpaceX, Iridium, and OneWeb, all three came out with some best practices with NASA's CARA program, which I think is a great sign that this is not a competitive differentiator, but an industry responsibility, much like you would never imagine an airline to point to another airline with some sort of mishap and use that for competitive reasons. I think we're going to move towards that direction, but it is still in its new stages, and tools like these SSA databases and automation, I think, are the direction that we'll see.
Yeah. So in one of the recent New York Times magazine, it was called the Space Edition, which is a awesome stage for space to be on. So I'm going to read a quote from, there was an article in it called Befouling the Final Frontier by Jamie Green. And the author, Jamie Green, quotes archaeologist Alice Gorman, who says, "If Earth orbit is going to be managed appropriately, we need to consider it an environment, not just the empty vacuum of space into which these objects have been put. After all the discussions for decades about the problems of space junk, all of the respective national authorities are just granting licenses without any coordination or without any other peers, without any consideration of what it's going to mean." So that's a pretty harsh assessment. Do you guys agree with that assessment or not?
So I'll take a first crack at it. I agree with half of it, and I disagree with the other half. So I agree with the first half that it's we've reached sort of a critical mass of the kinds of activities in space, the number of space actors, the number of space objects, as Audrey mentioned, and our aspirations for what space should be. We're no longer thinking, oh, space is big and we can just leave that there and nobody will ever notice. I think we've moved beyond that, and there's an active discussion about how space systems operate, how they interoperate, how they coexist, how they affect the space ecosystem. So I think it is appropriate to think about the effect that you have on space. And from what I can see across the space community, not only are companies kind of morally impelled to think about this, but they're also commercially considering this because they also want to make sure that their services can continue to thrive and evolve. The part that I have, I think, just a factual disagreement with is the idea that this is happening in this sort of wild west of no regulation, no oversight. As someone who's put in, quite a lot of paperwork at the FCC, it's silly to say that there's no oversight. As someone who spent a lot of time at the International Telecom Union, it's ridiculous to think that there's not a sense of international discussion on this. As someone who spent time at the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and their Science and Technology subcommittee, it is incorrect. It's just incorrect to say that this is happening without any consideration of what it's going to mean. What I think really needs to happen is an unfolding discussion about how much self-motivation companies or governments have to do the right thing, what the right thing actually is, how much of that needs to be compelled by regulation, how much of it needs to be encouraged by incentives, and what that actually entails today, but also with a sense of evolution, given the dynamism in the technology where we see new options available, every week, that we leave room for that as well. So that's my half right, half not.
Yeah. And if I could just build on that, I have spent a considerable amount of my career representing the United States at the United Nations and in the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which Patricia mentioned, which did, over a period of about 10 years, negotiate a set of guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. And so there does exist this sort of corpus, if you will, of international guidance on how owner-operators, governments, regulators should act in order to maintain space sustainability. So the challenge, I think, is actually not that we don't know what to do. Because if you add, sort of that guidance plus some of these voluntary measures that Patricia mentioned of some of the large constellation operators getting together and saying, these are the things that we think all operators should do. I think it's actually become pretty clear in the last couple of years of what responsible behavior in space looks like, whether that's putting maneuverability onto certain types of constellations, whether that's communicating and sharing data, all the things that we can go talk about. I think the real challenge is implementation at actually the national level. And every country is going to be different in terms of how they implement that based on what their national laws, regulatories, and policy structures look like. And I think in the US, we are finally starting to grapple with this question of how to regulate, if you will, for space sustainability. And I don't know that it has to be a heavy hand because of all these voluntary measures that industry is coming forward with. But I do think that there is actually a pretty growing recognition that this is an issue that needs to be considered going forward.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from both of you is that companies and governments are invested in managing this situation. I mean, as a journalist, I feel like every couple of days there's a new initiative. I mean, last week, ESA launched the Zero Debris Charter that they had been talking about and putting together over the last few months, asking companies to sign on. And then just yesterday, the Global Satellite Operators Association put out a code of conduct on space sustainability. So that's just like a snapshot of 2 initiatives, but there are so many more that are going on.
I actually think we're suffering from a proliferation of initiatives, by the way, on space sustainability. There's actually too many, which isn't to say that that's a bad thing, because it's good that there's this growing global awareness of this challenge and this desire to tackle the issue. But it's almost like there's too much guidance, and we really need to sort of simplify and focus so that everyone is sort of meeting the same common standards.
I do think the checklist, I think Audrey's point that there's a clear, emerging checklist of what a responsible space actor is and does. I think that's true. And I'm encouraged that new countries that are trying to utilize the services from space, trying to develop manufacturing or industries in space or develop space operations are not just trying to do this without an eye towards their effect, but they are, I think these many sets of guidelines and best practices and codes of conduct are establishing the right way to enter the space industry or the space sector for countries and companies that are just coming in. And I think that's encouraging. That's a good sign.
I would quickly like to echo the thought of transparency and how critical that is for us to all play safely together, mostly to keep industry accountable, right? That's the biggest goal, is to make sure that they are incentivized and properly held accountable to make systems sustainable and make sure space is usable for future generations. Since there is no clear standard at this point in time of how we can all operate the same way in space, it's all going to keep changing and all be different. So it's important to make sure that industry can be held accountable by a group of some kind and make sure we can still be transparent amongst one another nationally and definitely globally.
That's a really excellent point. And I think it's one that probably has the fingerprints of the national security and government origins of space on it most. I would encourage you to try and find a satellite license, the text of it, the conditions, the requirements, the technical information from almost any other country besides the U.S. You sometimes can't even find out the date that a satellite was authorized. So there's a lot to do, and I think in this instance, the U.S., for better or worse, it's Sunshine Act and transparency at the FCC, at NOAA, et cetera, I think is a leader in making that transparency in what's being proposed. And I hope that other countries start making that not only more public, but also give an opportunity to comment as the U.S. does. It's painful, but it is, I think, ultimately quite valuable.
Yeah. I want to follow up on the kind of proliferation of initiatives that Audrey mentioned. And Patricia, you talked about how it's good that all these things are kind of shifting the conversation, that now there's, more norms that are expected. And that's a big part of the conversation. But which entity is people say that space is like the tragedy of the commons, that there isn't one government or one group that has final authority over the situation. So how do different countries, intergovernmental organizations, how do we break through this to kind of say, okay, this is going to be the true final standard?
That's an interesting question, because it's framed in the construct that there's a value in the monolith.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure that I would say that in space anyone benefits from a single hand on the lever. I think this governments and companies have all kinds of different objectives when they consider space projects. I think there's a lot more that could be done internationally in terms of education for space agencies, countries that want to use space services and how that can be a benefit to them, for countries that want to develop a space economy, manufacturing or services, how to do that and kind of gain the benefits of it. But I don't know that there's the presumption of your question, I think I take issue with.
That's fair.
I don't know that there's a tragedy at all in space right now. It's not that long ago that we were bemoaning the fact that we didn't have regular, affordable access to space. Now we've got it. We actually are living the dream right now, which is that you can imagine a space project start to finish in your lifetime, and even in your employment at a company, and see it flown to space and provide the services it was meant to provide. And that's something that it's not been that long ago that was just something we hoped for. So I don't take the premise of the tragedy, and I don't take the premise that a monolithic oversight to this would yield anything like the environment that we're seeing now. I'd be interested to see what Kristen, you and Audrey have to say.
Well, I was just going to add, so I just came back from Paris, where I attended the Paris Peace Forum, which was held over Armistice Day or Veterans Day here in the U.S. And the purpose of the Paris Peace Forum overall is to promote governance, international governance. How do we improve and strengthen international governance? And this year, as I think last year and possibly the year before, there was an entire track devoted to space issues and international governance of space issues. And so this question that you asked, framed a little differently, but the basic question that you asked of how do we govern space came up. And I think there was really universal or near universal agreement that there isn't going to be some like international organization like ICAO or IMO or something like that, or at least not in the near term, that is kind of the centralized place where space governance happens at the international level. I do think there was some recognition of the need actually for a multi-stakeholder approach to space governance, to bring in the perspectives, not just of governments, but of the private sector as well, where you have the opportunity for all these different voices to contribute to this discussion of international standards, international norms, international data sharing protocols. And why I hesitate to sort of point to one sort of model or another, because I'm actually not sure that there's one existing model that fits the space situation perfectly. I do think it's not yet, the model that it's not is sort of some international organization. I do think it's a model where you're able to bring together a bunch of different stakeholders and, agree maybe too strong of a word, but at least build consensus around what are those standard practices and guidelines that everyone is following.
And I do want to give credit to the group Confers, who is actively working on setting some of these international standards and guidelines for best practices when it comes to in-orbit docking, capture, any sort of in-orbit services. They've done a great job of at least setting the stage internationally for an option for users to do a sustainable service in orbit. And I also want to give credit at least to Senator Hickenlooper that introduced the Orbits Act, and it's been a bipartisan passing in the Senate. So I am encouraged to see that there is legislation moving forward to make space more sustainable, and that we can call upon different guidelines like the ones from Confers in order to try our best to make sure that this can happen.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think we spent a lot of time talking about satellites, but there's all kinds of other space activity where I think we see a lot of the DNA from early space programs. Look at the Artemis Accords with, I don't even know how many countries, 30 some countries, I think now. It's an extraordinary kind of alliance for space, not just satellites, but space. And I think that that practice of talking to each other and collaborating and seeing common outcomes is a very impactful lane to kind of keep our eye on.
Yeah, there's been a lot of momentum on space sustainability and space collaboration lately, which is awesome to see.
I think we just have to remember some of this stuff is some of the space activities that are emerging are brand new. And it's not that countries aren't working together for a common oversight, is that we don't, the technology is just emerging now, and the kinds of oversight that might be required, I think, are just emerging. We're just now learning about our effect on, about what effects may come from a space activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to go back in time a little bit to a situation that was, I think, probably a catalyst for change. So the New York Times article referenced the 2009 collision between a defunct Russian satellite and an Iridium satellite above Siberia that created more than 2,000 pieces of debris. The article says that in the wake of this collision, various U.S. government agencies took on the responsibilities of space traffic control, tracking satellites and known large debris, alerting operators when a close call is coming. So Audrey, can you talk to us, for those who might be watching that aren't aware of what happened there and the action that was taken afterwards, about how the U.S. government and commercial companies responded to that event?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was in government at that time. It was one of my very first, not my first job, but it was pretty damn close. Pretty close to my first job in government, was really being responsible for some of the actions that followed. But I do remember actually quite vividly the day of the Iridium Cosmos collision. I was actually at an event, a government-only event, with a bunch of general officers and things like that. I mean, they actually interrupted the event to talk about this and to sort of deal with it in a little bit of real time, because it was such a moment, something that really hadn't happened before. If it had, it sort of wasn't aware. I mean, it's sure there were collisions between small objects in space, but not this kind of sort of big active satellite against another defunct satellite. So that moment really did spur the U.S. government into action. And it's actually really interesting because there had been legislative authority several years prior to that. I think it was 2004, but I'd have to go back and check. There was a pilot program that Congress established in early 2000s called the Commercial and Foreign Entities Program, which was intended to test, basically the parameters of sharing space situational awareness information that was generated by the Defense Department, sharing that with the private sector and with foreign, international operators for the purpose of spaceflight safety. And this pilot project had sort of been out there and authorized by Congress for several years, and it was just failing to gain traction within the U.S. government. And then, that day in February 2009, when the Iridium Cosmos collision happened, I mean, that really was the spark that sort of spurred everyone to start to take this more seriously. And so from that moment then, you had the Defense Department take ownership over, I wouldn't call it space traffic control, because I think that's way too strong of a term, but definitely take ownership over what we called space situational awareness sharing for the purposes of spaceflight safety. So DoD was already essentially tracking objects in space. What DoD wasn't doing was the routine assessment of potential, we call them conjunctions, which is a sort of a word for collisions, although it has a slightly different meaning, but potential conjunctions between two objects in space, providing information to the owner operators who might be affected about those conjunctions, and then helping them resolve it so that we would avoid making the situation worse. And it took about a year or two to really get the program stood up. But by the early, 2010s, 2011, 2012, I mean, it was sort of a functioning system. And now it has warts. And I actually would love to hear Patricia's perspective. She was in the private sector in an industry association at the time. But it was sort of the best we had, because before we had nothing. Now, over time, that system, the processes that DoD had evolved and they improved. But at some point, as this commercialization of space really took off, this mission became a huge one. And it really wasn't an inherently military function. It was really being done by the Defense Department because the Defense Department had the infrastructure, the sensors, the analytic capabilities, the orbital analysts, the people, the expertise. But it really didn't belong in the military. And so in the last administration, Space Policy Directive 3 was issued that directed the Department of Defense to transfer that responsibility to the Department of Commerce. And that's kind of the world in which we're living now, where the Department of Commerce is working to stand up what they call TRACS, the Traffic Coordination System for Space, that will take over that space traffic coordination role. Now, the one other thing I'll add before I turn it to Patricia is over this same period of time, you had this emergence of private sector companies like Slingshot, who saw this market opportunity, not just to observe objects in space to supplement the data that was available, but actually to own this space traffic coordination mission as well. And so now you've got companies like Slingshot with a product we call Beacon, which is essentially doing the space traffic coordination mission for those owner-operators that choose to be on our platform, enabling autonomous coordination between, say, two large constellation operators to avoid those collisions. So the tools, the technologies, the systems are sort of in place now, and really it's just a matter of kind of bringing it all together, transferring it to commerce, leveraging the private sector to keep the innovation alive, and then figuring out how we coordinate between, national systems in the U.S., the Europeans, et cetera.
Yeah, that was definitely a crystallizing moment. I think, we like to think about a more smooth evolution of space oversight and governance, but I think that, like in many sectors, it's these forcing events that force a revelation. And I think the revelation that particular collision caused was really the very beginning of what Audrey started the session with, that 80% of the objects on orbit today are commercial. I don't know what percentage it would have been in 2009, but I think it was more than the U.S. government thought it was. And they probably hadn't been considering what a significant profile commercial companies had on orbit. Because I do remember that I was running the Satellite Industry Association at the time, and had a couple of my members in an active dispute with the Air Force about trying to get better data and better collaboration, and in particular that there hadn't been as much communication about the environment at low Earth orbit. So I think that that was the forcing event, but it was the sort of the threshold to get over, where the recognition was that a space actor, whether it's commercial or government, needs the same kind of high fidelity, actionable information at its fingertips to be able to avoid avoidable disasters. Now, I think we still have the scenarios where non-maneuverable objects could create a problem with another immovable object, another non-maneuverable object. But what the future that I think is right upon us is that what's on orbit is increasingly maneuverable. What's known about those objects is increasingly precise, and the ability to coordinate, to make good decisions, and avoid those kinds of collisions are highly improved since then. And then if we move to the next sort of element of what we see in space, you could see that some of those immovable objects will then start being, I'm hopeful that there'll be incentives to remove them, and the technology that companies like Astroscale and ClearSpace and others are developing will be able to reduce the non-maneuverable risk.
Yeah, that was great inside information from both of you on where you both were at the time. That's, Audrey has the government perspective, Patricia being president of SIA during that incident. That's just super interesting to hear from both of you. Okay, so we've got a number of topics and issues that I want to ask how increasing space activity and congestion have an impact on. So the first one I want to ask about is astronomy and the field of astronomy. Patricia, do you want to take that one?
I do. So I've been involved in this fascinating conversation for since May of 2019. I was leading up government affairs for SpaceX's Starlink project, and the company had just launched their first stack of 60 satellites, which in itself was sort of a surprise. Most people didn't know that was what we're going to be able to do. It was a great sort of start of constellation work for that company. But very quickly, it became clear that the spacecraft were more visible than we had considered. We hadn't really considered the visibility of it, and I think astronomers, particularly ground-based optical astronomers, were really struck by how bright these satellites were and how unusual that configuration of 60 satellites in a line were, and it caused an outcry of concern from astronomers. And I think one of the most interesting things is that they had really not been looking at the evolution that was very obvious if you were reading via satellite. If you were going to any kind of space or satellite related events, you would have known that there were tens of projects that were filing at the ITU and looking for licenses from the FCC to fly. This, we were on the front page of the New York Times. It really wasn't a surprise. 5 years of public consultations and coordinations with the National Science Foundation. This was not a hidden project, but the astronomers were really they weren't engaged with this satellite side of things. And for our part, we asked whether there were rules or guidelines or standards, targets, and none of that really existed. There was no, if you're this bright, you're okay. If you're brighter than that, it's a concern. So it started a really fascinating conversation between, at the point, my then company, SpaceX, and astronomers that's now, I think, broadened to a whole host of satellite companies that are planning to deploy large and small satellites and large and small constellations at low Earth orbit, and trying to develop a new practice, which is to understand how visible, how bright, how reflective spacecraft will be, and how that affects, in particular, ground-based astronomy, both the bulk of the telescopes that are narrow field, that just look at a very sort of specific sort of vantage point, and the most modern telescopes that are being built now that take tiled vision pictures of the sky all the time. So this has created a really interesting dialogue. I think it's created an awareness of two stovepipes within the space community that didn't have a lot to do with each other. To their credit, I think SpaceX has evolved some pretty interesting and first of breed solutions to try and reduce the visibility of their satellites, and then also make those technologies available to others. The astronomical community, for their part, have been very active and eager to have respectful conversations about how this works, and kind of learning on both sides how we affect each other. And the outcome has been a center called that was set up by the International Astronomical Union, the National Space Foundation in the U.S., and the Square Kilometre Array organization, which is a radio astronomy group based out of the UK, building telescopes in Australia and South Africa. And that International Center for the Protection of Dark and Quiet Skies from Satellite Interference has been this fulcrum now for scientific review and observation of satellites in space, and an industry hub that I'm helping to shape with companies that want to learn more about it, want to that are of goodwill and want to know what they can do at various stages of their development, even though this is sort of in a very early tech development stage, and become part of that new intersection. I think there's a lot of promise in the most recent mitigations that have been fielded. I mean, SpaceX put their second mitigation on over 4,000 satellites, which is a pretty extraordinary industrial commitment to make a design modification for astronomy. And now they've done another one that I had pretty good feedback so far. So I think we're on the right path, but it was another one of those, kind of crystallizing moments where we share the skies, but we sure didn't know each other. And I feel like we're on a really positive dialogue path now with some fascinating technology underway to support solutions.
Well, and if I could just add one quick thing here, one of the services that Slingshot offers is actually the ability to measure a satellite's brightness. We can use our optical telescope network to basically assess the light curve of a given satellite. And so when some of these new requirements started being issued that constellation operators had to mitigate the effects on the astronomy community, we started to have conversations with some of the companies about their satellite brightness. And one of the interesting things that we hear is that the companies don't really have a baseline understanding, just based on sort of the design of their satellite, of how bright it's going to be. And the brightness is a combination of the design and how it's actually operated, how it's facing. And so, I mean, this is really early days, but there are now not just these technology tools that Patricia mentioned to mitigate the effects, but there are also these services out there to even understand what your brightness is in the first place, so that companies can make more responsible choices about how to operate their satellites in a way that doesn't have to interfere with the astronomy community.
That's an awesome point. And I think these kinds of tools, right now, there's no predictive software that I'm aware of that allows you to put your CAD design into it and sort of predict whether you're going to be bright or not. There isn't an ecosystem of testing labs like there is for anechoic chambers. There's nowhere that you send your satellite and have it tested for a physical test article for its brightness. At this point, you launch it and use a service like Slingshots, or the center has developed a kind of voluntary kind of crowdsourcing observation, which probably isn't as quite as consistent as using a private list of radars, but or telescopes. But if you can't even tell how bright you are, this sort of underscores how early we are in this game. But the good news is, I think there's a lot of interest in it. There's not a requirement anywhere that you meet a certain this target that was set about 2 years ago. But there is, I think, a growing sense that you should take that into consideration, even if the solutions are still in their very early stages, and the options of how to assess your system are still just emerging. But Slingshot's got a great solution there.
And I think one other thing to take away from Patricia's entire explanation of this and how we've come here is this wasn't an issue that had hit critical mass yet. And that's something that we're constantly vigilant of in low Earth orbit. But the response to a community that wasn't typically considered a stakeholder in our typical concept of the space industry, they were heard, they were listened to, and there have been drastic responses to how the industry plans to execute missions in the future. I think that's a fantastic demonstration of perhaps how we can operate in the future before we hit critical mass of a potential sustainability issue.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kristen. I think this shows that satellite operators are in fact space operators, and that they have really, I think, picked up the concern about their effect on other space activities, and without having to judge which one's more valuable. We just coexist. That's there's clearly usefulness in what the space satellite world is delivering, and the astronomy world has had extraordinary discoveries in the past decade. So we want to keep that going.
Yeah, it sounds like there's been some great progress made there on collaboration between the satellite operators and astronomers.
And I should just make a little pitch. If you're a satellite operator and you're watching this and you want to learn more about it, go to the IAU CPS, which is the Center for the Protection of Dark and Quiet Skies. And it's free to participate, but it's a great way to stay abreast of this quickly moving technology.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so on the issues that space activity and congestion can impact, what about the cost to the satellite operator? So whether that's manufacturing cost, launch cost, insurance, I feel like insurance could be affected. Are we going to see increasing space activity or congestion impacting the cost to the satellite operator? Kristen?
Yeah, of course. So I'm excited to see how the cost of the future of launch, the future of manufacturing will change as we deal with congestion and reduce the congestion in orbit, but also find new ways to reuse, reduce, recycle, even refuel in orbit. This could completely change the ecosystem and actually reduce costs to the operators in the long term, right? If you don't need to launch with a certain type of manufacturing that requires you to live forever in orbit, right? If you can think about new ways to use your spacecraft beyond its typical mission life, the costs may drastically change. And I'm excited to see how that can actually change in the future. I believe we're at an inflection point today to where we are with our, old school way of designing satellites and using space to a potentially new, very exciting way of using space and the infrastructure that we're slowly building to make space more sustainable.
So instead of maybe insurance rates going up because of risk of collisions with congestion in space, you're saying costs could maybe actually come down with more sustainable technologies.
I believe so. I believe that there's ways to make sure that, say, the satellite that you initially launched isn't in the correct inclination. Well, maybe we can change that. Maybe we can get it to the right inclination, and no longer do we need to make an insurance claim for a satellite that can actually have a correction made for it. I think that will help the insurance industry in the long run.
Interesting. And we'll close out with this one. How is increasing space activity going to impact policy and regulations? We've touched on this a lot through the discussion, but are there any further policies or regulations that you guys expect to see in the next few years?
Well, I first wanted to just note that anytime there's a technology or an industry that's evolving really quickly, there's going to be a gap between the regulation and oversight and the innovation and technology development. And I can't imagine a sector that has faster evolution and innovation than our space sector right now. So what we're seeing is a couple things. One of them is, I think, countries are taking note of this excitement, investment, innovation, the potential of space as an economic driver, the interest in having a space sector themselves. So there's a promotional aspect to most governments in that they want this to be a sector that thrives. Second, not all of the countries have a well thought through regulatory structure. In many cases, communication satellites, which were the bulk of the projects to date, had been regulated by the telecom regulator, and then there might be a Ministry of Space, but it's not necessarily the same people. They don't necessarily have the same backgrounds or the same familiarity with particularly the physical environment in space. We're seeing that in the U.S. with the creation of a space bureau at the FCC, with the sort of integrating work that the Office of Space Commerce at the Commerce Department is doing to try and knit together all these many agencies that have something to do with space: the FCC, the FAA, NOAA, NASA, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence community. It's an interesting diffusion of stakeholders in the U.S., but that sometimes, in a smaller sense, may exist in other countries as well. So you've got to get the right people together to make good decisions. But I think these international fora, like the Paris Peace Forum, where Audrey was this last weekend, like the UN organizations, where the UN has a long history of activity in space, can be sources of education and information for new space regulators to make good decisions. I don't think we have a lot of deliberation about how to get towards good decisions. We talked about that earlier on, that there are good hallmarks of responsible space action, and those hallmarks can be put into oversight or into some kind of incentive structure. So I think that's my view of it from sort of a global perspective.
And I know we're running short on time, Rachel, but I just wanted to add one quick thing, which is, there's a very active debate going on right now in the US about what's called mission authorization, which is how do regulators regulate not just the camera on board or the communications on board, but the overall satellite mission. And I think we're going to see some movement on that in the next couple of months, both on Capitol Hill as well as with the administration. And I think it'll be a really interesting to see whether or not these proposals for mission authorization include authority for regulators to actually put in place rules related to spaceflight safety and space sustainability.
That's very interesting. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Kristen, Patricia, and Audrey. Thanks for joining us today and sharing your awesome expertise on this topic.